Okay, so this is Against the Ubiquity of Fictional Narrators by Andrew Kania, apologize, I always say your name, in Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism from a few years back. And Cinesemiotics requested this, so as always, let me know what you think. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns along the way, if I don't explain something well, just let me know. But it's my first time reading this too, and we're going to see what it's about. Okay, so Against the Ubiquity of Fictional Narrators. All right, here we go. A large group of artworks can be usefully classified as narratives. These are works that tell stories. It is a far from easy task to set down criteria for membership in this genus, and I shall not be attempting that here. Am I a fictional narrator? I don't think I'm fictional. I mean, you can find out my real name. Noger, No Gray, whatever you want to call me, is like whatever. Like, it's who I am on the internet quite often. I don't think it's fictional, though. Like, it's a question, what is fictional? Maybe the author will get to that. Usually it means it does not exist in, like, the physical world. Although there's many things that exist that don't have any physical, physical instances, like numbers. You could say they have instances, but the number itself does not. Like, who knows what the number 2 is? So I am a persona. But I don't think I count as fictional. No, yeah. Because a fictional narrator exists in a fictional world. And as far as I know, this is not what we call the fictional world. It may be fictional for somebody else. We might be in some other being's mind, and this whole thing is their fiction, but that's not what we call. We call this one real for us. So, like, this is what, like, we're not calling this one fictional. We call this one real for us. So, that's kind of how it goes. And if you want to say this is a dream or whatever, this is what we call real, though. Like, this mutual delusion that we exist in. So, I'm a realist in that sense. Like, this is the real world. Okay, rather taking the genus of narrative artworks for granted, I will investigate one species, narrative literature. Okay, so we're just talking about literature here. A number of recent theorists, notably Seymour Chapman, Gerald Levinson, and George Wilson, have argued that there is necessarily a fictional narrator in every narrative, a conclusion I call the ubiquity thesis. I shall argue that the ubiquity thesis is mistaken, since paradigmatic novels and stories have no narrator in the sense these theorists employ. Though I limit my discussion here to literary narratives, what I propose could be adapted for other species of narrative, a point I return to at the end of the paper. Okay, so this setup here seems clear enough. Some people say that there's always some narrator in a book. That's the ubiquity thesis. I guess that's all the stuff that isn't explicitly attributed to some character in the book. Then there's a narrator in the book. And this author disagrees with that. I guess you'd have to say that the perspective of the book does not have to be in the fictional world. It can be outside of the fictional world, and therefore there is no narrator that's fictional. It could be a real person in reality that is telling you a fictional story. So, this seems like that could happen. Oh yeah, one last thing. If you guys stick around to the end, we rate all of our papers nowadays, and you guys will have a chance to have a rating to rate the paper, and that will be recorded for time immemorial when I get the website up, but I've been too burnt out to get it done, so it's not done yet. Anywho, continuing. The nature of the fictional narrator. Before we investigate whether or not novels invariably have narrators, we should establish... let me drop the music, it's annoying me, sorry. We should establish the nature of the snark we are hunting. Okay, so we're already pulling in some fun words. We're hunting snark here. I shall be disputing the ubiquity of a narrator understood as possessing just two essential features. The first is agency. Chapman, Levinson, and Wilson all point out that narration is an activity, something that gets done, and as such implies an agent. But their strongest motivation behind specifying agency as a feature of narrators, is that it is a broader concept than humanity. What the heck does that even mean? Agency is just not humanity. Okay. Yeah, see, this is why people actually like to talk about fictionalism and fiction, because this agency point here is that you're talking about things that have agency that we don't normally think of as having agency. So if we talk about Chat GPT or other AIs as doing things, as like, having an agency. It's the same concept here. And this is why these papers are kind of important, because they clarify what is actually going on with agency and humanity. Okay, it is easy to point out that if novels have narrators, they often know more than and have powers greater than any human could. Thus, a ubiquity theorist must insist from the start that human personality is not a sine qua non for narratorhood. It's fair. You can have like God as your narrator, and clearly God does not need to be limited by human smallness. Okay, the second distinguishing feature these narrators have is fictionality. That is, these theorists claim that each novel's narrator is on the same ontological level as its characters and events. All right, so this is the one I already said might be where they're getting in, because you could have a real person narrating a fictional story. Again, they are at pains to point out that the claim is not that the narrator is a character in the traditional sense, though this may be the case, for example, in most novels narrated in the first person, merely that it is not to be posited at the level of actuality, but rather at the fictional level. Yeah, see, they're saying that the narrator is not an actual person. I'm not sure that this is going to hold already. Like, oh, let's not do that. It's not what I want to do. So it's the level. The narrator is at the fictional level. Okay, let me also make clear that I do not deny the existence of fictional narrators. They most obviously exist in first-person narrated novels. Yeah, so like if you consider the the Sherlock Holmes stories, they are narrated. They're stories told by Dr. John Watson. So Watson is a character in those books. He is also writing the stories. So in that case, the narrator is fictional. But that's not what the authors are saying here. They're saying, of course, some of them are, like Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories. But the characters in the stories that are narrating, like the ones that don't take part in the story, then they are somewhere in the fictional level. Okay, author says, let me also make clear that I do not deny the existence of fictional narrators. Indeed, it may be that most novels have fictional narrators, but I will argue that a certain central kind of novel has no fictional narrator, and that the ubiquity thesis is thus false. My strategy will be to investigate the main arguments for the ubiquity of fictional narrators in novels. I'll make use of several observations that George Wilson makes in Le Grand Imaginaire Steps Out. Sorry about how I pronounce anything other than boring English. Oddly enough, Wilson is there a ubiquity theorist, yet I believe his criticisms point toward a more restricted role for fictional narrators, one that he is simply unwilling to ultimately accept. Okay, so now we have a bit of a setup. Basically, these people are wrong. We're going to find out why. The analytic argument. We have already touched on the first argument for the ubiquity of fictional narrators, what I call the analytic argument. The authority to look to here is Chapman. He argues that every narrative is by definition narrated, that is, narratively presented, and that narrative presentation entails an agent even when the agent bears no signs of human personality. Agency is marked etymologically by the er or or suffix attached to the verbs present or narrate. So yeah, presenter or narrator. The suffix means either agent or instrument, and neither need be human. The notion of non-narrated narrative arises as a misguided effort to restrict agency to human beings, but the restriction will not hold. And see, this is the fun part. And I know like a lot of people here aren't like, oh, who cares about fictional narrators? This is why this is important, because all of a sudden we can say the exact same thing about the AIs now. Okay, so we're not really that far off from like the previous discussion. Like we're talking about human versus non-human narrators. What does that mean? Wilson and Levinson both cite parts of this passage, and Levinson offers his own formulation. Quote, if narration means anything, it is the conveying or imparting of a story by means that is media that are distinct both from the story being conveyed and from that which is doing the conveying, that is the narrative agent. I believe this argument is sound. The only way I can imagine attacking it would be to claim that narration is something like biological growth, an event or process but not an action, therefore implying no agent. I find this suggestion untenable. Stories do not simply appear out of thin air, they do not occur naturally independently of human agency as the growth of trees do. Paisley Livingston has argued that it may be indeterminate whether or not any given narrative has a narrator. I cannot countenance this either. It is a simple conceptual point that stories must be told in some way by something. So it's like, yeah, how is a story told at all? And if you ask ChatGPT to tell your story, it's presented on the screen. Now, is that a telling of the story, or is that a printing of something, which is not a telling of a story, but just like pixels on a screen? Well, that you can worry about. But in this more looser sense, then this is a telling. Yeah, that's a question. All you people who have used all the AIs, do you actually think it's telling you anything? Like, is it actually narrating a story to you, or is it something else that it's doing when it presents the response to your input? Okay. However, we should note that the conclusion of the analytic argument is fairly weak. All it says is that there is an agent who is responsible for the narrative. This is compatible with the view that there are no fictional narrators. For authors would seem to be prima facie candidates for the agents responsible for their narratives. They do things that result in the stories we read. So the ubiquity theorist needs more to establish even the existence of fictional narrators, let alone their ubiquity. Yeah. I mean, that's fair. It's like if you're going to say, well, everything has to be written, it's like, well, yeah, there was an author. That's fine. But that doesn't mean they're fictional narrators. That just means it was written by somebody. If it was an AI or a person, that's fine if that person was in the real world or the AI was in the real world. Okay. 3, the ontological gap argument. Gerald Levinson has provided the strongest argument that in order to make sense of our engagement with fictions, in addition to the author, we need to posit a narrator at the fictional level. Though Levinson focuses on narrative film, it is clear that he would extend his argument to narrative literature. The argument has two main stages and is founded on questions about how it is we come to know what is fictional in a work. The first is a positive stage. It seeks to establish something. Levinson argues that we can reasonably expect an answer to how it is we are being given information about the world of the fiction we are reading or viewing. And the obvious answer is that someone is presenting it to us. Reason, albeit reason operating in service of the imaginative understanding of fiction, demands an answer to how it is that a world is being made visible to us, and that demand, it appears, is only satisfied by the assumption of an agency responsible for that. The notion of a presenter whose main charge is the providing of perceptual access on the fictional world is simply the best default assumption available for how we make sense of narrative fiction film. And goodbye. Thank you for stopping by. Have a good stream. Like, here's the thing. Speaking of Anne and other online content producers, I am, like, and this goes to Viper's thing too. I have a show here. I am presenting stuff. Is the stuff I'm presenting to you fictional? I mean, am I normally sitting in front of a webcam reading philosophy and talking? No, this is not how I am all day. So I'm only doing this now. So, like, this is not like my natural state, if there is such a thing. But does that make this a fictional character or a persona? Well, it is a persona. It's part of me. And, like, Aris has met me. I can guarantee you I'm very similar in person. And he said so. And so it's like, what are we presenting? Now, Anne, on the other hand, and forgive me if you've already left, but, like, Anne has I think, a bigger, makes more use of a persona than I do when she streams. So it's like, Anne is not exactly who she is all day. I think it's farther away from her normal self. And I don't even want to say normal. It's farther away from, like, her stream self and her non-stream self have, I think, a bigger gap. So the question is, which one's the fictional one? Meh, who knows? They're different parts of you at different points. And so it's like, I'm not sure. So yeah, so on Anne's side, it's more fantasy. So it's interesting, though. Hey, Frank, what's up? How you doing? Frank says, even if the person presenting and the person are basically identical, it can still be a character. Yeah, I think that's more on how it is for me. I mean, I am trying to make a show here. I am mostly just, I'm not like making more of it. I'm not as fantasy persona. I'm not trying to make any fantasy out of myself. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm, trying to explain philosophy and do some other stuff at the same time. But like the fantasy here isn't like me. It's that philosophy actually makes sense. That's the fantasy. That's really the conceit here, is that we can actually explain what the fuck people are talking about. Um, so that's the fantasy I'm presenting. The fantasy isn't on my side, it's on the philosophy side. Frank says, I've noticed that most stand-up comics play an exaggerated version of their quirky selves. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think got showed up mostly with the recent stuff with, what's his name? The philosopher who got yelled at, or he got into a lot of trouble. Not yelled at. He did get yelled at, but he got like semi-canceled for Louis C.K. for like, masturbating. But like a lot of his stories surrounded sort of like this creepy guy sort of behavior, and it's like, yeah, it turned out to be an exaggerated version of some of the things he had been doing. Well, thank you, Anne. It's like, ooh, I hope so. It's like I've told people before. I know a lot of us got on Twitch because during the pandemic we had we didn't have a connection, and so it's like Twitch got a lot of us through the pandemic by having this connection that you can make with people online. So it's like that's part of it. Now, would I be exactly the same in person? No, I'm not exactly the same. Like, I'm not exactly the same as I am on stream as I am in person. But again, like I was saying, it's closer for me because I'm not, I'm mostly trying to explain philosophy, and that's the fantasy there, that philosophy makes sense and that we can talk about it easily. It's funny to say that out loud, but like that is basically the conceit of Philosophy Roulette, that I can read this shit and make it make sense. But yeah, so this is the thing. Again, so what the quoted author here is saying is that there's a person who's giving you access to the fictional world, and I guess the big argument then that these people, the ones that support the Ubiquity thesis, is if that they have access to the fictional world, then they're part of the fiction too. You smell fire? Well, get out of your house, vipers. Oh dear. Okay, yes. Everyone, pray for vipers. Like, pray for vipers. Oh, that's not good. I hope he's okay. I hope nothing's bad. Okay. That's not good. All right, well, we will continue with this fantasy of reading philosophy. At first, this may not seem to establish anything more than the analytic argument did, but as these quotations make clear, the ontological gap argument goes beyond the analytic argument by restricting the class of narratives being discussed to fictional narratives. Hence, the real bite of this argument comes at the second stage. Frank says, if you're looking at a square and is actually one face of a cube, is the square a fiction? See, I wouldn't call it that. I mean, it's like, this is why I have this quarter here. Like, this is a U.S. quarter. Like, I'm sure, I don't know if, like, you can, it's like, yeah, there, like, you can see good old George Washington right there. Yeah, or one face. All right, that was good job, Cinesemiotics. That was funny. But, like, is this a circle? Is it a circle now? Because it looks like the surrounding is like an oval now. It's like just the little angle change is different. Is that a fiction? We don't call it that. We call it like, look, you have a perspective and you can only see so much at once, and it's always a limited perspective. We don't call that a fiction, though. Fiction would be like, all right, this isn't a quarter. Like, this is something other than a quarter. And it's like, no, that's not what we mean. Like, then that would be a fiction, because I'd be like lying about saying something that isn't the way it is in the world. This is a U.S. quarter, but like if I say it's a circle, like, is this like perfectly circular or almost perfectly circular? It's like, yeah, it may appear to be almost perfectly circular then, but now it doesn't. Now it's like, very much more like a line. So we don't mean, what we mean by fiction is different than that. But like, it's a good point. Where is the actual boundary of what we're calling fictional? So this is the thing. And this is interesting, that this ontological gap argument, that if like the narrator is kind of part of that world, they're providing perceptual access. So this is what they mean by it's an ontological gap. They are part of it because they provide access to the fictional world. So they're in some sense part of it. Frank says, if you hold up a coin and don't know whether it is a quarter or a nickel and say it is a quarter, is that a fiction? Again, this is not really what we would say. We'd say, look, okay, so if I called this a nickel, which it is not, this is a quarter, like I can see kind of there, and I call it a nickel, and then someone say, hey, no, man, that's a quarter. I said, oh, I was wrong. I said something that was incorrect. It's like that was a farce or like a fiction on my part. Yeah, you're getting closer to how we use the word, but again, that's not normally what we meant. When you're saying something about the world, you're not saying something about a fiction. A lot of times the way people, I've heard philosophers describe fictions, is you're talking about like a different world. Like there's a world in which different things are true. And so like in this world, this is a US quarter. In a world where I call it a nickel and it's a nickel, then it's a nickel in that world. But it would be a fiction to call this a nickel. To call, like, if I was talking about the other world, then this would be a nickel, but I'm saying in the fictional world, the coin I'm holding is a nickel. And in this world, the coin I'm holding is a quarter. And so it's like, if you don't know, then you can be making a mistake or you could be like confused, but you could call that a fiction, but you're saying like in the world where you were not confused, in the world where you were not mistaken, then that would be the fiction in the other fictional universe. And that's why they're talking here, about the access to the fictional world, because philosophers a lot of times when they're talking about this is they're thinking of a whole different universe. It may be almost exactly similar to ours, where in every other world, like the only thing that's different is that this is not a quarter, it's a nickel. But like again, we're talking about a full world that's just like ours, but differs in a few respects. And so you're talking about access to that world. And so when you make mistakes, it's like, yeah, you can use the word fiction, but like that's not what the philosophers are doing. So it's like that's just not how people in this area talk about fictions, because they want to be clear like what the difference is between a fiction and like a mistake. Vipers, it's from outside, so either someone lit a bonfire earlier, it's another wildfire. Yikes. Okay, yeah. I mean, sometimes it's just people having like, cookout. Hopefully that's all it is. But like, yeah, it's a little scary when you start smelling smoke and you're like, I don't know where that's coming from. That's not good. So yeah, but like that's the question. What do we mean by fiction here? It's like, So like, do we know it's a bonfire or a wildfire for Vipers? We don't know, but we're not going to call that a fiction if we turn out like, oh, I think it's a wildfire, and it turns out to be just someone cooking outside with too many little too smoky wood or whatever. It's like, no, it's just like, okay, we were wrong. We guessed wrong. Okay, so yeah. Where were we? The second stage is negative. It seeks to deny that an agent who gives us epistemic access to a fictional world can coherently be considered to occupy a different ontological level from that world. Yeah, again, they have access to that world, so they're somehow in contact with it and part of some other world. You doubt anyone is barbecuing it too? Oh, that's right. You're not. I'm sorry. Time zones. But you're right. Yes, Vipers does not live down the block from me. Okay, so the basic idea is that if the narrative agent were outside the fictional world, at our ontological level, say, it could not coherently present us with the story, events, and characters as if they were real, that is, on its own ontological level. Hence, the narrator must be fictional and thus cannot be the author or filmmaker. Yeah, so if they have access to the world, then they can't be in our world. Here's a question. Can you have a trans world narrator? Can you be in two worlds at once? Like you can look at this stuff over here and that stuff over there, and then tell the people, like from one world what's happening in another world, like a portal or something. I don't know, but like that would be enough for the ubiquity thesis, because then you'd have one foot in the fictional world, and so part of you would be fictional. So that would, I guess, be enough for the ubiquity thesis. And that's why this is a strong argument for the ubiquity thesis, that like if you have a narrator, then they have to be engaged in the fantasy. And again, like I said, why is this important? people don't think this stuff is important. This is talking about models of the world, like we were just talking about with the AI stuff. And people were making claims in chat that if the AI starts having better world models, then it will have better ways to, that it'll get much more effective. That's exactly what we're talking about here. How do you have access to world models that are separate from the real world? So, this is further contrasted with the author exactly. Did I just say that? Oh no, I was going to read this quote, I think. But they're going to say that here. Hence, the narrator must be fictional and thus cannot be the author or filmmaker. So it's like it's this line right here. They're going to reiterate that cinesemiotics. All right, and here's the quote. A narrator and the events narrated by the narrator must be on the same fictional plane. So yeah, this is the world, the same fictional plane. Otherwise, cognitive relations posited between the narrator and events would not make sense. The implied filmmaker can't be in the position of directly affording us, as with a silent gesture of behold, the vision and audition of something that is only fictional with respect to himself, namely the characters and their circumstances, that remains the prerogative of the film's narrator or presenter, who is, in a fundamental sense, one of them. I'm sorry, I'm tripping over so many of the words today. Yeah, so in some sense, the narrator has to have access to the fictional world and be engaged with it in a certain way, and so they are one of the fictional peoples. In some sense. Okay. Author says, there are problems with both stages of this argument and I will address them in turn. For the positive stage, George Wilson makes some telling observations about the coherence of the foundations of fictions that should give us pause when considering Levinson's claim that we can reasonably expect answers to questions about our epistemic access to fictional worlds. Wilson points out that there may be paradoxes or incoherencies at the very base of fictional works. So what? Who cares? Like, it's not like we have our world all figured out. So who cares if the fictional world doesn't make 100% sense? Our world doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to us most of the time. So I'm not sure that we'll see what the author does with that. For instance, the author says, a novel may represent itself as a copy of a diary that must have been destroyed in the story culminating fire. Okay. More commonly, it is indeterminate whether the narrator is supposed to be thinking the words we are reading, speaking them aloud, or has written them down, and in any case, how we are supposed to have gotten hold of a transcription or copy. The nicest... Oh, I see what's going on here. Okay, we'll get to it. The nicest example is provided by David Hill's, quote, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, represents itself as a carefully crafted 300-page memoir by its title character, a barely literate young man getting ready to set out for the territories because the prospect of any work that requires him to sit still terrifies him. End quote. In sum, the reader imagines reading a transcription of the narrator's own utterances or inscriptions, but her imagination does not specify anything about what makes it possible for her to do this. Fictionally, it is indeterminate how the reader can be acquainted, as she is, with the product of the narrator's storytelling performance. All right, so who is this? Yeah, see, this is interesting. I'm sorry to do this, but I apologize. I could read this paragraph because I can read this David Hills person way better than I can read the other authors here. Like, this paragraph flows a lot better for me. The point is here, and here's what my guess is. Here's what my guess is here. That if the narrator's in the story, how did you ever get the physical book? They are in their fictional world, and we are in our world. So they need to have 1 foot in our world, 1 foot in their world. But there is no way we actually have access to another universe, the fictional universe in this case. So the question is, how did that happen? So, all right. Author says, now the point of marshalling these observations here is to repel Levinson's first sally. If reason does not demand an answer to how we come to see or know about the fictional world, then the one that Levinson provides, namely that there is a fictional narrator, is simply odious. Of course, that will not be a very powerful rejoinder if the second stage of Levinson's argument leads to a successful theory. If a theory explains something, we do not need any extra motivation to adopt it. I will get to the adequacy of the second stage soon, but there is yet another problem Wilson's point raised for the first stage. Yeah, so it's like, how do you get how is the novel here? Like, if we have a fictional book, let's go find one. None of these are fictional that are near me. Okay, so let's assume this book is a book of fiction. It's not. It's art. But let's just go assume this book is a book of fiction. And the narrator was fictional. How did this book ever get to our world? Because it's in a different universe. And philosophers are serious about this when they say that. If the book is from a different universe, it could not have gotten to our world except like through like, some platonic realm. Like the book was there and then it got up into the platonic realm and then came down to like somebody on Earth, like real world Earth. So it's like, how did that happen? And that's the argument here. It's like, seriously, if you're talking about like the fictional universe as a real universe, how did it get to our world? Philosophers are full of shit. Well, this is why we read these papers, to see who's arguing for what. Currently, we are on the side of the author, because the author is calling other people full of shit right here. But again, like this, maybe this argument is not like super relevant to all the other things, but like this is the whole story. How do you actually attribute agency to, hey, Tommy, what's up? Speaking of fellow philosophers. Tommy is a streamer here on twitch.tv/T0MY and plays a lot of shooters like PUBG. Let's give Tommy a shout out. That's not how you shout people out. T0M. There we go. So much shit, so little intestinal capacity. Yeah, I mean, well, this is why we read papers, to see who's more full of shit. So far, we are on the side of the author, and it's not just because Cinesemiotics recommended this paper, but because the paper is sort of narrowly focusing other people are wrong, and we do that a lot here. And so we'll have to see what the final conclusion of this paper is. If it's just other people are wrong, that's fine. But like, it's not like a grand conclusion, just that philosophers are full of shit. It's like, okay, we knew that, but we didn't know exactly why these authors are full of shit. And secondly, sometimes they're full of shit in interesting ways. And like, maybe their shit doesn't, or is maybe the reason that they're wrong is interestingly wrong. And hopefully that will actually, be worth something. Because like I was saying, if we're attributing agency to non-human objects, we've been doing that all day, like with ChatGPT, this stuff does matter. And this is why you can't really discount a lot of philosophy, because you just don't realize where these things overlap. And this is one of the places where fictional stories, well, those are really just world representations and how we interact with them. That's all it is. That's all a fictional story is a different representation of the world. Okay. Yeah, and so blah, blah, blah. Okay, so suppose reason did demand an answer to the question of how we have access to the fictional world. And suppose we answered by means of a fictional narrative agent. What leads Levinson to believe that reason will be satisfied with that? Surely there are further questions to be asked, such as what sort of agent this is, how it knows so much about the world, and how it imparts this information to us. It seems odd to suppose that reason could take this first step onto the slippery slope of fictional foundational questions by asking how we come to know about the fictional world, and then get a satisfactory grip with such a tenuous answer that there is some fictional narrative agent, thus managing to resist sliding any further. Yeah, so basically what the author is here is saying, we are in the real world, the fictional agents in some other realm, maybe like platonic realm of the forms or something, and then we need a pineal gland that translates between the world of mind and the like our world to get like the from the realm of the forms to the realm of ideas to the realm of like human thoughts to actually, or like humans, the real world, to make this work. So like, this is literally what this narrator is doing here. What do we got? We got a GIF. Let's see what we got here. Copy link. Yeah, so Vipers is not really having this shit. That is a cute kid, though. Yeah. Descartes has entered the chat. Well, this is exactly what's going on. We've got we are entering like the area of fiction, like an area of mind, and then you have to bring it back. How do we have access to this? So it's like, these are like classic questions. So it's like, I know this is like, talking about fictional narratives, not everyone's favorite thing, but like, these are important questions. So how do you resist sliding any further into the Descartes? Like, this is exactly the question the author is asking. This problem is even more glaring in Chapman's exposition. Immediately after an extended argument that reason demands an explanation of how we are presented with the story and that a fictional narrator is the only possibility, he goes on to say how the narrator came to know the provided information seems a non-question. This is a curiously sudden loss of interest. Yeah, exactly. So how does the pineal gland work? How do you access the realm of ideas? How do you access the realm of forms? Well, it's just not interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's literally the biggest hand wave. Leave it to other people. It's not interesting. So I'm on the side of the author here. Okay, however, even if we grant Levinson the first stage of his argument, the second stage is untenable. All right, so even if you say you have some sort of access, we don't know what it is, but say we have access, like an imagination gives us access. That's all we're going to say here. What is the imagination? Don't ask that question. We're just going to call it imagination. That's how we access fantasy and fictional realms. I turn again to Wilson for my cue, the author says. He makes a simple but crucial distinction between actually telling and fictional telling. In The End of the Road in 1958 is John Barth's second novel. It is a first-person narrative by the main character, Jacob Horner. We can thus distinguish between the actual telling of the fictional story, which John Barth engages in, and the fictional telling of the story engaged in by Horner. Wilson's observation is that each of these tellings, by the analytic argument, entails a teller, but he points out that only the fictional telling implies a fictional teller, just as a fictional shooting, say, implies only a fictional gunman. The actual telling of the story implies only an actual teller. Now, it so happens that Horner is, in Gregory Curry's terminology, a controlling narrator. It is fictional that he produces a text identical to the one we have before us. It also happens that The End of the Road, the book, is the most coherently founded fiction I know. The text implies that Horner has produced it as scriptotherapy. I don't know what that word is. Scriptotherapy. A part of his ongoing treatment at the remobilization farm. That's a very scary term. It feels very 1950s mental hospital-y. Unlike so many well-founded fictions, this explains not only the existence of this text in the fictional world, but also its literary qualities. But neither of these points is essential. David Copperfield, Wilson's example, is a first-person narrative by the eponymous main character, but it seems unlikely that Copperfield is a controlling narrator, and hence the fiction is ill-founded, or at least indeterminately founded. Yeah, so if you have a novel where they have written it down saying, I'm writing myself a novel, that's one thing. If you have a novel that's from someone's voice, but there's no time where they say why they're writing it or when they're writing it, then it's like, well, what is it? It's ill-founded. But clearly there are still two tellings here. Dickens' actual telling of the fictional story and Copperfield's fictional telling of his life story. There are plenty of problematic cases also. It is not clear that we can take the belated, intrusive first-person narrator in John Fowles' The French Lieutenant's Woman to be the actual John Fowles, as the narrator tries to imply, at least on one level, or whether he is rather another fictional entity. Yeah, and so then sometimes you get people who lie and try to wrong foot the reader. What's it called? Frankenstein, of course, is written as a series of letters. And so that, because Dr. Frankenstein is writing letters about what he has done, about the monster and stuff. And so then you've got a series of letters. But of course, that's a controlling narrator. Dr. Frankenstein is writing letters about what he has done and what he's undertaken and stuff. And then things are they're found media, someone has found these letters and put them into a book. But of course Mary Shelley is writing that, so it's exactly who's writing what here. Okay. Author says, however, I would argue that there are also clear cases where there is no fictional telling. Graham Greene often writes in a plain, third-person, omniscient narrative style. In The Heart of the Matter, 1948, he tells the pathetically tragic tale of Scobie, and I see no reason to suppose that anyone else does. Of course, there are various embedded narrators in the novel. Most of the characters tell stories about their lives in most novels, but there seems to be no reason to posit any overarching narrator other than Greene. The book as a whole, unlike David Copperfield or The End of the Road, is simply not fictionally narrated. Alright, so this is a little bit weird. The author here, the main author, has literally just said, nah, In this one case, Graham Greene writes in plain third-person omniscient narrative style. How does Graham Greene, they're just saying this is not, Graham Greene is not in any way, shape, or form part of the fiction. Now, here's the question. Is Graham Greene projecting some part of themselves into the story in some sense? Are they actually creating a fiction of themselves that interacts with the fictional world, and then they have access to this sort of fiction of themselves? Maybe. But that's the question. How does Graham Greene come up with this? I mean, you of course have an imagination, you come up with things. Now you have a whole world where the story exists. But is the narrator part of the story, or is there part of your imagination that somehow has this imaginative access? So I think the author was a little too fast here, because they just say no. They just be like, no. Here I would argue there is also none, because they didn't really argue this. They just say this is how this is the case. Now, I don't know this book. Maybe it's very obvious that it's Graham Greene talking, the author. Yeah. I'm not sure, though. But it's definitely different from these other books where people in the story are telling part of their own story in that fictional world. So Mary Shelley is not part of Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein's letters, or John Watson's letters in the stories of Sherlock Holmes, it's John Watson narrating the story that he is part of. Okay. The negative stage is part 5. At this point, Levinson might fairly point out that I can claim all I want, but a claim is not a response. Hey, there we go. The second stage of his argument was precisely meant to show that, though at first glance it might seem that actual authors narrate their novels, this is incoherent because they cannot make assertions about the fictional world that are clearly being made. Someone at the beginning of The Heart of the Matter claims that Wilson sat on the balcony of the Bedford Hotel with his bald pink knees thrust against the ironwork. Graham Greene is clearly not asserting this. He of all people should know that neither Wilson nor the Bedford Hotel exists. Indeed, 4 pages earlier, he has told us explicitly that, quote, no character in this book is based on that of a living person, end quote. Anyone prepared to make the assertion about Wilson and the Bedford must be at the fictional level, and Graham Greene is simply not. The simplest hypothesis we can make is that there is a fictional narrator who offers us these facts about the fictional world. Yeah, so again, if you are going to describe a fantasy world, you need to be part of the fantasy yourself to know the fantasy world. There are 2 ways of responding to this second stage of the argument. First, one can emphasize the continuity of Greene-style fictions with other fictional narratives where we do not infer a fictional narrator. Traditionally, the oral storyteller is given as an example. To bring things a little closer to home, consider telling a joke. Philosophy. Sorry. It makes me laugh. Here you begin to tell an audience about an American, an Australian, and a New Zealander, but only the most churlish listeners ask for more details about them, or how you know them, or why we should trust what you say. Anyone who knows about joke telling knows that these people do not really exist, that one should merely imagine that the events related occurred. An improvised third-person omniscient bedtime story is even closer to the case of the Greene novel. Indeed, I cannot see any relevant difference in kind between the bedtime story transcribed and the Greene novel. We know that the novel is just a story. We know we are only supposed to imagine these events having occurred, not to believe they actually did, let alone Greene believes that they did. All right, so here we go. We finally got to the imagination right here. And this is the thing. We're now using imagination as the technical access to some fantasy world. So this is the pineal gland now. We have the imagination gland, and the imagination gland allows us access to what we call the fictional world. But what is the imagination? We don't know. Is there an imagination gland like a pineal gland in the brain? Hell no. But this is the thing. How do we actually explain this? And now we're getting into trouble. This is serious trouble here. We can't explain this. So, how do you have models in your mind that aren't real? We can't explain this. Frank says, I think defining fiction is difficult because there is a smooth spectrum from fiction to nonfiction. Yeah. I think you were getting at this earlier. How do we use the word fiction? And like sometimes we're using it in different ways that are sort of like false, but like not necessarily, or we might not have known false. Viper says, we hallucinate all reality, and fiction is simply a hallucination we know is false. Sure, but like, why do we know it's false then? Like, sure, but why? Like, do our fictional or our fantasies push back in certain ways? Like, if we're dreaming, can we feel pain? Do we get pushed back? Like, if I want to like go to the bank and take out like $1 million, I can't do that. I don't have $1 million to take out. So it's like the world will push back. So it's like, but the question is like, if I do that in a dream, it won't do that. Like, does the world, like, there's have to be something empirical in our world. Like, how do you actually know something's false? It's not an incongruity. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere, Vipers. See, now we're getting into like, what is an incongruity though? And then when you're going to get like incoherencies, you're going to get contradictions, all these sorts of like logical terms and conceptual terms about how we describe rationality. And that's a good discussion, but like it's not actually like, you can say that, but then you get into the rationality discussion and like we can go there, but like this is exactly the problem. Like, what is rationality then? Frank says, and so I'm not sure there is a sharp distinction between Dickens' telling of a fictional story and David Copperfield's telling of his non-fictional story within the book. It might be a smooth continuum from one to the other. Yeah, like this was the issue I was trying to say. The Dickens that is narrating the book is not actually Charles Dickens. It may be some version of Charles Dickens. It may be some like, like I'm have a persona here. This is some version of me. This is not like the complete me. It's not what you get. Like any given like little slice of me is going to be like, whatever I was at that time. And you're getting me at the time when I'm broadcasting. And so it's like, is that like exactly me? Or is that like in some sense, like as you say, like a spectrum like of me, like with other stuff and like other parts of the fiction? Yeah. So it's like, yes, you're correct. But like, how do we break this down so like things make sense? Hey, Eudaimonia, what's up? There are fictional books from another reality. This entertained unprovable fictions. Yeah, can a nonfiction imposter its way in? That'd be a grand like lucky chance, I guess. Like if you have a fictional book that has from another reality and then it gets something right, it would seem to be that would be incredibly lucky. Or the author was being very cutesy. So yeah, it's like there's a spectrum here. But again, back to the idea that there's like an easy spectrum between the actual author and the fictional one. Saying it somehow spectrum seems like a slippery slope. That doesn't really explain anything though either. But if we are entertaining that imposter could exist, then all of the non-fictions could be that. Yeah. If you're saying that there is like someone in the real world in the fiction, then that like they'd be very confused. Like, but like this is not true. This is like the world is not like this way in this thing. But like, how would the people in the fictional world know that? This always happens. Like you get someone like you send them back in time and like, oh no, you guys are wrong about this. And like, what are you talking? This is the way the world is. Like you can transport people like into like weird worlds. And like, I've seen media like that. People do this. So it's like, then like people are like, nah, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. So it's like, yeah, that happens. What's it called? There's a, ancient Greek myth where there's someone who knows the future and no one believes her. And so it's like she has like foresight. Her world is bigger than everyone else's, and they're living in their sort of like localized fiction that they think the world is, and everyone's telling her, yeah, it's Cassandra. Thank you, Vipers. Yeah, so like that's what it is, like a Cassandra type thing. And if anyone wants to go see a movie with this that talks about this explicitly, go watch 12 Monkeys. Because this is exactly what they're talking about. You've got Bruce Willis, who is a time traveler, and he knows information from the future, and no one believes him when he goes back to the past. And so it's like, where in the fictional narrative, like who's telling the fictions then? And they talk about this explicitly, and that's a fun movie. What's her name is in it? Shoot, I lose names quick. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like, but this is what we're talking about. So, but again, what is the imagination? How does that work? No one knows. Okay. Author says, of course, it is not just Graham Greene who writes in this transparent style, but he is an ideal example. Other commonly suggested candidates for exemplars of the style are Ernest Hemingway and 19th century English novelists. I believe the latter are much less simple and unproblematic than they are usually taken to be. Okay, so like imagine a person like who writes an IKEA manual. Everyone know what an IKEA manual is? It's a manual for putting together furniture. The furniture that the person is writing the manual for does not yet exist. They have not yet produced the stuff that someone will be doing. So it is fictional for them. Are they a fictional author? A fictional narrator? That's what the author is saying here. Is the IKEA author a fictional narrator? You don't think so. You don't think of them. But the objects that they are writing the manual for don't exist because they have not been produced yet, because the manual will eventually be for some future thing. Frank says all stories are fiction. Some stories are also non-fictions in some contexts. Fair. But like I think we are explicitly talking about like things that were not meant to be about the real world when they started out here. So intentions matter. At this point, like we're not starting out like when we're just talking about things, and so it's like, yes, you're right, and I know you gave me a smiley face, and I know you're kind of like, so it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but like gotta be clear on what the philosopher is saying here. The philosophers are not talking about all things we're talking about. They're talking about things that were explicitly fiction. Unreal Brian says, for some reason earlier today I was imagining what it would be like if there were surgery tutorials done as IKEA instructions. Yeah. Speaking of, one of my favorite people who doesn't really stream is Sarah Aladela. Let me see if I can find her. And, let's see. Sarah Aladela? Can't spell. Let's see if this works. Sarah. Nah, I think there's two. No. Yeah. Shoot. Yeah, but like she does, she does like instruction manuals for sarcophaguses, like how you embalm people. It's like part of her art. She does these really cool things. Let me go see if I can, because they're so cool. I want to find them. No? Come on. Oh, I follow so many people now. Why do I follow so many people now? I was right the first time. He has more A's. Oh, come on. Why you no come up? This is not her. Not Sarah Day. No. Sorry, it's just like it's too much. Oh, dag nabbit. Ah, I misspelled it. Okay, so here we go. This is what we're talking about. This shit's cool. So like yeah. Yeah, that was it. Sorry, Tommy, I wasn't looking. Okay, so this is it. Like she does these like crazy like cutouts of sarcophaguses and stuff, and they're like animated. Oh wow, our site's been updated since last time, so it's like you don't click on them, but like you've got like cutaways and things. Oh man, they're fun. So like, how do you embalm someone? And so like this is just a lot of things. And so she streams here on Twitch. I don't think she's streamed in a very long time, but like yeah, she just streams under her name, so it's like twitchtv.sarah.aladela. So yeah. Let's give her a shout out. Yeah. So there you can see her, yeah, that's her image thing. So you don't have to give her a follow or whatever, but like you can go find her her socials and her links down there too. So like she's really cool. And she's like an architect actually. And then she does this on the side. So she's great. Yeah, like I mean look at that fucking craziness. Okay. Anywho, where were we? Okay. Sorry about the interlude. It was funny. I was in her stream and we rated Shane once, and Shane's in a lot of our streams. And he was like, "Oh, whoa, that's very nice." And he's like, "Let me check out your art." And he's like, "Oh my god, this is good." It's like, yeah. It's like I'm not taking some crappy artist to Shane's stream. Okay. So author saying a lot of people are this, and this is why I brought up the instruction manual maker. Are they writing fictions? Because they may be writing manuals for stuff that doesn't exist yet, but it doesn't exist now. So that's a fiction. So, yeah, maybe. Okay. Author says, there are often surprising interjections in the first person by narrators of indeterminate ontological level or incoherent attempts at founding the fiction. Yeah, so all of a sudden, sometimes the narrator knows too much all of a sudden. Author says, I shy away from Hemingway as my example because of somehow his prose retains a forceful personal style despite his complete narratorial self-effacement. Though none of this shows that there are fictional narrators in all 19th century fiction or in Hemingway's works, it militates against using those works as rhetorically persuasive paradigmatic examples. Green seems the ideal transparent stylist. Yeah, so if you just have someone who's writing in the style of a instruction manual, then it's very hard to say that they are part of the fiction. They're more like a technician from an outside perspective. There is a second way to criticize the second stage of the ontological gap argument. This is to point out that it has internal tensions that ultimately undermine it. The second stage is based on the idea that the artist cannot present the fictional world to us because he or she does not stand in the right relation to it. The two are on different ontological levels. This problem is solved by positing an agent at the fictional level who thereby does stand in the right epistemic relation to the fictional world. But it is not clear that this is a solution to the problem Levinson sets up. The problem is that we have a bunch of things at the level of the real world, the artist and the audience, for instance, and a bunch of things at the ontological level of the fiction, the characters and events of the story, and there is no bridge from the latter to the former, no way for the fictional to be presented to the real. The proposed solution is to add one more entity to the fictional world, a narrator. But how does this help us? If we could not simply look and see the fictional world, how is one more fictional entity supposed to change that? Another way to see the problem is to ask, if we cannot understand how the artist can reach down and show us the fictional world, how is it that the fictional narrator can reach up and show it to us? In fact, if we must choose between these alternatives, surely it makes more sense to accept the former. Does it? I guess so, yeah. I mean, the author has to be able to reach down into the fictional world, like their imagination somehow reaches a fictional universe. Clearly fictions... Oh, wait. Viper says, are Shakira's hips a fictional narrator if they don't lie? Well, when you're writing fictions, you're not lying. You're telling a story that is not meant to be true, but you're not claiming it to be the real world either. So Shakira's hips are not making any claims about a different world. They're only making claims about this world, and they never get that wrong. They are always correct, and they never tell a lie about this world. So no. They are not a fictional narrator because they are not telling stories about other worlds. They only tell stories about this world, and they never are wrong. They are actually an infallible oracle of knowledge if you have access to Shakira's hips. It's a good question, Vipers. I never thought I'd say. I am. Oh, very, very. I was not expecting to say that Shakira's hips are an oracle. Like, that's, I think, the one of my crowning achievements for this week. Yeah. The oracle of Shakira's hips. Yeah. Okay, clearly fictions are in some sense part of our world. We really do interact with them, so we should be able to have some sort of access to them. All right, so now we're getting into the pineal gland crap I was talking about before. Tommy says they may not be an oracle, but they are hypnotic. Fair. O'Brien says Shakira is the sole source for a priori truth. Perhaps, I don't know. Like, a lot of people think rationality is, but maybe her hips are super rational. Could be. Author says, but it is not clear that the real world is part of every fictional world, certainly not in the same way, so it is not obvious that a fictional entity could have any intentional relation to a real entity as presentation or telling implies. Thus, it makes more sense to suppose a real agent could show the fictional to us than a supposed fictional agent could. Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. You need someone in the real world with an imagination to come up with a story. Not someone in a fictional world who has like super powers to come out and then emerge or like ex nihilo present a work of art here. Or be apparent ex nihilo at least. Yeah, and like I said, if you want to get into like the old metaphysics, like where this is like Platonic. Where do ideas come from? Where do like concepts of numbers come from? We have to have access to the Platonic realm. It's not the Platonic realm punching down into our universe and giving us these things. It makes more sense the other way. And so it's like, how do we actually do that? Well, you have to have some sort of faculty in the brain. Yeah, the hips don't lie. Okay, a ubiquity theorist might try to respond to this apparent inconsistency in a number of ways. She might suggest that the narrator just presents the fictional world in a certain way, but not to us. We just happen to be in the right place at the right time and see what it is presenting. Or perhaps the narrator presents it to other unspecified fictional entities, and we look over their shoulders unbeknownst to them. But apart from specific worries about these particular suggestions, such as the coherence of the idea of a presentation to no one and the epicyclic multiplication of fictional entities, they miss the main point of the objection. Unless the narrator has some sort of ontological dual citizenship in the real and fictional worlds, then there is still an ontological gap between us and the fictional world. And this is what I was saying, where they have to have one foot in both. Like, you have to have part in both. And like, this is exactly what the problem. It's like, well, how do you actually do that? It doesn't really make sense. Because like, you're not really in a fictional world. None of us are really in a fictional world. You may have an imaginative world, but that's still part of our world that you're like using at that point. That's not what these people are saying, that there is a narrator in a fictional world that we have access to. That's not true. You have your imagination about the fictional world, not someone in another world that has access to us. Okay, now one might ask what the problem with such a gap is, and indeed I do not have one. Exactly, since dual citizenship, ontological dual citizenship. Okay, so if you are willing to bite the bullet, the author is saying, well, fine, okay. That's funny. But this avenue is not open to the ubiquity theorist. If the ontological gap between the real and fictional world is not a problem, this strategy cannot get off the ground. For without a problem, there is no need to posit another entity, a fictional narrator, to explain our access to green-style fictions. Yeah. So it's like, if you are just like, cool, we can have access to it through imagination, fine, but then still there's no other narrator there because the author is imagining it. Gerald Levinson has responded to my criticisms of the ontological gap argument. He claims as common grounds between us that John Barth and Charles Dickens, quote, wrote text which, when imaginatively engaged with in the prescribed way, convey stories, and that fictionally Jacob Horner and David Copperfield are telling us their stories, end quote. But he denies that this licenses the conclusion that Barth and Dickens are telling fictional stories. But if John Barth and Charles Dickens do not tell fictional stories, who does? On Levinson's view, no one ever tells fictional stories, that is, no actual person. Okay, so yeah, exactly. That means you've got demons in your head when you are like, and this is not a new idea. When I say demon, I mean it in the sense of you have voices in your head, and the voices in your head that are not under your control, and they are telling you the story. This is access to another realm again. This is a very weird view, but this is a view people have. And when I say demon, Socrates claimed he had a demon in his head. It was not demon in like our Western Christian sense. It's a demon in the sense like voices in your head that spoke to you. So maybe some sort of like mental disease we might call that now, but like maybe not. Yeah, someone in my head, but it's not me. Yeah. So this is the thing. And so this is the thing. No one ever tells fictional stories, no actual person. It has to be something else. Some sort of trans ontological or trans fictional universe being. That can somehow punch out into our real universe. And is this a demon or is this a spirit that has inhabited us? These are old theories. You know, like people used to say this. I was inhabited by the spirit and it moved me to write the story. But like, we don't think about that. We don't think these things anymore, but that's literally the claim here. All right. Levinson does restrict his view to straightforward, reported fictional narratives, avoiding the special problems of postmodern and other storytelling fictions. So there is a position in logical space where one would allow that only the postmodernists and their ilk tell fictional stories. But again, note the oddity of this conclusion. Postmodernists are supposed to be notorious for having rejected storytelling wherever possible. I maintain that writing a text that we're imaginatively engaged within the manner prescribed by our fictional practices conveys a story just is one way among many of telling a story. Yeah. So, it's Pink Floyd. There's someone in my head, but it's not me. Okay. There might be some youngins who know. And if you are, do not tell us because this is 18 plus. I'll kick your ass out if you say you're under 18. Because I curse too much. 6. A minimal theory and some consequences. Author says, I have acknowledged that there are two ontological levels involved in our engagement with fiction and that we are on a different one from the characters and events of the fiction, and yet that we come to know about the fictional world. How could I claim there is no problem here? The answer is simply that though there are two ontological levels, there is no relevant ontological or epistemological gap. It seems to me that we learn about a fictional world from the person who invented it, the artist, through the medium of the artwork. Concerns about how we have access to fictional worlds seem to me closely analogous to the problems about how we have access to possible worlds that Kripke was at such pains to dissolve. Yeah, and this is exactly the thing. This is why I was so confident in telling you what was going on with like that they're positing these crazy like worlds that are separate from ours, is because this is how it's talked about in the literature. Kripke made possible worlds as like, you know, different possible logical things that we could discuss, and then fictional worlds are just like these possible worlds where, you know, like the possible world where this is a nickel and not a quarter, but then you could make a fictional world where we're saying, well, we're not talking about the actual world anymore, like our potential actual, we're talking about all these potential actual worlds that are very different from ours, but we're making a fictional universe. But it all comes down to this Kripke theory. So a fictional world is not like a distant planet that we need some magical telescope to find out about. Its nature is just as stipulated as that of any possible world we might propose. It is stipulated by the artist through the work, so to learn about it, we engage with the work. Yeah, and so basically it's the real world, and then you keep making little modifications or big modifications as you need to along the way. Everyone knows it's not the real world, but that's fine. Okay, as Wilson points out, and well, actually, it's not fine. How do we actually do this? Well, then you have to have some theory of imagination, which is not given. And I have my problems with the way Kripke describes possible worlds. I think they're, I don't love them. So I'm not going to go into the problems here. But like this is the thing. Because once you have these possible worlds, you need like the imagination, and then that's unexplained. And then, like, creativity and other things are unexplained too. Okay, as Wilson points out, if there is a fictional narrator, it is usually pretty obvious from the work. Viper says, where do religious texts fall into all of this? I mean, I'd put them in just fictional works myself. But of course, people think some fictional works are real. Like, so that's a good question. Like, I guess there's different kinds of religious texts. So if, like, you've got, like, the Christian tradition, you've got, like, Jesus is the three, God is split into, like, sort of three aspects or whatever. You've got, like, stuff like that, which is very hard to parse, like, in everyday life. Jesus died and came back. So you're actually expected to believe all of this on faith. You're just supposed to believe it outright. So the text is not meant to be fictional in that sense. It's meant to be something you are supposed to believe. As I'm not a theologian, if anyone knows, correct me. But like, for me, who's not Christian, I treat it as basically a fictional text that someone does believe. So it's like, that's okay. It's just I don't think that's how the world is, and so it's like sort of an incorrect theory of the world. That doesn't mean it's not like the stories don't have meaning to people. Of course they do, but then you could have like very different sorts of religions. Like, Buddhism is very different from Christianity, and so like Buddhist texts might be very, very different. Yeah. I might need to get more water depending on how long we go. So, I don't know. It might depend really on the kind of text and what you're supposed to do with it. But a lot of the stories in religion you're supposed to take at face value as just being the way things were, or the way things are. And then, but again, like, then there's a lot of stories, and then there's a lot of things about God, and you're, yeah, and you're not actually, and you're supposed to take that on faith too, just like straight off believe. So it's like, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, for me, who was not a believer, it's like I just see these as basically fictions, things that the way the world could be if it were different than it is. Okay, let's see, where were we? All right, so yeah, there's pretty obvious, like, usually you can tell by who's narrating in the book. If the story is told in the first person, ostensibly by someone with a different name from the authors, and it is sold as a novel, we have many good reasons to suppose that within this fiction being told, there is also a fictional telling by a fictional agent. Sometimes the signs are much more subtle, as in the popular example of Henry James the Liar. But sometimes we have simply no reason to suppose there is a fictional telling of the story we read or see. In the heart of the matter, Graham Greene spins a good yarn, but there is no reason to posit an overarching fictional telling within it or coextensive with it. One advantage of my theory is that it can deal with all literary fictions, although one has to look at each case individually. Of the ubiquity theorists, only Levinson points out that the theory may not be able to handle, in Walton's terminology, storytelling narrators who clearly signal the fictionality of the story they are presenting. The two examples Levinson gives are William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair and John Fowles' The French Lieutenant's Woman. My view is that Thackeray is indeed narrating Vanity Fair, just much less self-effacingly than a Graham Greene, while Fowles' narrator as impresario is too tricky to allow us to identify him unproblematically with the author. Yeah, so this is one of those, maybe the author is acting in a certain style as narrator, even though it is the author, but like they're doing something themselves, like they're being more in like a character of themselves. But again, I like the example of who's actually making like an instruction manual author for a product that does not yet exist. So it's like you've just got like the concept of it. And so you're writing fiction about things that don't exist, but like, who's the author? Is that a fictional person? No, you've got it in your imagination. There is almost no way to write a instruction manual for something you're trying to create in the real world, even if it doesn't exist yet. So it's like, I can see like not the most boring, because you can read, like, instruction manuals can be kind of cool, and that's why I showed the Sarah Aladela art. But it's like, it can be very cool, but it's like, yeah, there is no fictional person at that point, or fictional narrator. It's just the narrator's imagination. Okay, let's get this done. We're almost, it's only got 2.5 more columns to go. Whether or not you agree with my individual interpretations, ultimately our decision about whether there is a fictional narrator will be part of our intentional explanation of any given artwork. Both Vanity Fair and The End of the Road have inconsistent chronologies, yet we believe only the latter has an unreliable narrator in the usual sinister sense. Why? Because part of any complete understanding of The End of the Road must take account of the deliberate concealment of the inconsistent time structure. It cries out for explanation. But the temporal inconsistencies in Vanity Fair, while even greater, seem merely to be errors, a function of the book's serial production. Nothing of interest to an understanding of Vanity Fair comes from a close investigation of the confusions of its temporal structure. Similarly, whether we posit a fictional narrator in the heart of the matter or the liar is a question of what it would buy us in terms of understanding these works. If I understand these works correctly, the supposition of a fictional narrator in the heart of the matter would get us no further than the intuitive understanding that Green himself is telling the tale. On the other hand, the supposition of a fictional narrator in The Liar makes sense of its boss-eyed view of the action and gives rise to further interesting critical questions. I mean, there's a question like maybe the fictional narrator, if we leave the ontological gap problems aside, is just the most boring person in the world. Like the narrator of like a instruction manual is just an incredibly boring person. So again, that would be like, it would just be a version of the author then. That wouldn't be a fictional narrator. It would just be the most obvious way to explain something that you know how to do. And I would assume instruction manual writers are good at explaining things. But that would be the instruction manual person, the instruction manual writing mode. Kind of like me right now. I'm sort of explaining this paper. I don't normally, when I talk about stuff, I don't know, or I read stuff, I'm not breaking it down the way I'm breaking it down for you. But this is the me breaking down philosophy mode of No Gray Zero. Or No Gray Zero. It's funny because I've got half of the people online call me No Gray, half of me call them Noger. It's I don't care, but now I say it both every time. I have to do something about that. I'll just call myself Nog. I'll call myself No like Cryomera does. Anyway, okay, continuing. Let's get done. We can also use this general point to criticize some other narratological theories. All right, I have to criticize this author a little bit. Come on, man. What the fuck is narratological? Couldn't you have just said narrative theories? Seriously? Why do you have to say narratological? Gregory, it's kind of funny. Come on. I know you're a philosopher, you like making up words, but seriously, could have just said narrative. Why do you use the bigger word when you could have used the smaller one to get to one of Viper's earlier points? Gregory Curry, for instance, argues that we can eliminate external narrators, putting implied authors in their place. Now, it is not entirely clear what he means by an external narrator, but he is discussing cases of unreliability like James the Liar. Thus, an external narrator seems to be the kind of narrator the Ubiquity thesis posits, an agent at the fictional level, but not a character involved in the action. Viper says it's an accepted term in the narratological lismology. Thank you. I did not know that, Viper. It was very helpful. Curry claims we can do without these posits, explaining away this sort of unreliability as ironic narration by the implied author. This seems a Procrustean solution to me. Unreliable narrators do not usually seem ironic. They often seem sinister or treacherous in their underhand subversion of the role of the omniscient narrator. Moreover, there seems to be no good reason to do away with the unreliable fictional narrators. Unless we have an independent reason to suppose that all narratives are narrated in the same way by the same type of agent, there is no need to get rid of all fictional narrators. Let us introduce where we need them, but only where we need them. At this point, a ubiquity theorist might criticize my minimal theory by pointing to a possible parallel between hypothetical intentionalism and the ubiquity thesis. Hypothetical intentionalists argue that we should keep the hypothetical and actual authors separate in our theory, even when the author's actual intentions agree with an ideal hypothesis about them. Similarly, we might one not argue that we should always give both the actual and the fictional narrator a place in our theory, even though in some cases, for example in green-style fictions and most films, there seems to be no difference between the authorial and fictional narration. This is better said than what I was saying. This is what I was saying when you have a very boring narrator for something like a instruction manual. Author claims we should not. Hypothetical intentionalism is a theory about how we properly go about interpreting works of art. If it is the right theory, we can appeal to it. I'm like dying here. I only got to get a little bit farther. If it is the right theory, we can appeal to it in disputing the meanings of individual works, but whether it is the right theory is a meta question. The question of whether there is an overarching narrator at the fictional level is rather a question of the content of a work of art. That is, it is an interpretive question. I see no prima facie reason why we should suppose there is a general answer to it for all narratives, any more than we should suppose all narratives have a particular time structure. Of course, there may be secunda facie reasons, so to speak, but I have shown that those thus far suggested are unsound. Wow, I've never actually seen segunda facie, like as opposed to prima facie. Wow, that's kind of cool though. I have argued then that the best account of our engagement with literary narratives does not entail our always positing a fictional narrator, an agency at the fictional level that is credited with presenting the fictional world to us. Of course, since these are stories, there must be someone telling them, but unless there is some particular reason for thinking otherwise, I see no problem with the intuitive view that the person telling the story is the one who made it up, the author. I will end by mentioning two areas about which my minimal theory invites further thought. One is the extension of the theory to other forms of narrative art, particularly film. Due to the collaborative nature of film production, it is contentious whether there is a single actual author who could be thought to tell the story of the film. But it might be that the most important component of my theory is that an entity at the actual rather than the fictional level is responsible for the telling of some tales. This might be consistent with a view that implied rather than actual authors are the narrators of certain works. Another area in my minimal theory may have implications for the theory of interpretation. Viper says, Genesis 1:1. As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. Yes, Bronx Tale. Yeah. But like that's the thing. That's the author is part of the story at that point. The narrator is part of the story. So not the author, of course, but like it is. So some theorists argue that any consideration of actual artists engaging with the work is inappropriate, but such considerations may be unavoidable if artists are sometimes the narrators of their works. Yeah, I mean, fine in some sense. I kind of agree with this person. Like, why do you have to posit a third thing? It seems like it just creates and multiplies fictional entities, and generally you don't want to do that if you don't have to. The naive view that, look, it's the author sometimes just doing something, and yes, it is a time slice of the author at that time. Fine. It's like, yeah, but ruling that out outright seems wrong, and so I'm kind of on board with this author here. So let's review this. I don't know if there's anything specific we have to say here. Yeah, I mean, there's bigger problems, of course, but let's do the review. So anyone in chat now is welcome to throw their review in. You can use all the emotes you see there. They're BTT TV emotes. So like you don't need to be subscribed or anything to get the emotes. If you just see the text, you can copy and paste the text, and you can use the yay and nay global emotes for the also, and that's vote yay and vote nay. So basically, did this have fun ideas, make your brain dance? Grapes, did it make big claims that shriveled up? The navel, was this navel gazing only for academics? Also, Semiotics likes it. Good. So we got one vote yay. Thank you for the review. Ouroboros, are we talking about deep age, ancient questions here? The Scream, is this existential or artistic? I mean, this is probably going to get a Scream. Because we're talking about, like, imagination and stuff. Golden Turd, all style, no substance, still poop underneath. It's for bad analytic philosophy. This is not going to get a Golden Turd because it didn't fuck it up. Like, they made their argument, they made the point, and they were fine. And the slice and knife, they slice and dice their arguments. So we're gonna get some knives on this because they did slice and dice. That's what they did. They sliced and diced their opponents. Unfortunately, this is a little bit navel gazing because basically no one's gonna give too much of a fuck about this except for other academics. It's like, who was actually arguing about the author on the ontological level? This is the, Viper's yawn, what we got. So it's gonna get a navel gazing on this one, but it's also gonna get a vote yay from me. Vote yay. Oh no, that's vote nay. Vote yay. And we can get a Viper's yeah. So that's it. And this is basically one of these like where you just have to want to read it. Because like this has to be in your area. If you care about this stuff, great. This is a nice paper. I tried to show a few of the things. You agree with a bit of the navel, a bit of the knife. I mean, you can just put it in. Like you can put more than one in. Like that's the thing. If you like make it, you thought it was only a little bit of navel, just put one in. Yeah. So it's a C-section. That's, God damn it, Vipers. Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's why you should put a navel in then, Frank, because that's kind of what this is. Who cares? You have to be an academic that cares about this. Yeah, so that's the whole thing. So you get the navel and the knife, and that's basically seems to be consensus on this. Anyone else want to get in? I'll leave the screen up for a minute or so because it only records what you're saying during the time this screen is up. It doesn't record like use of the emotes other times. And so basically, yeah. But like, yeah, you have to care. Now, like I said, this related to a lot of ideas in philosophy. Like you have to read, but but it's not explicit in this. Like I was saying, the attribution of agency is interesting here. When you're attributing agency to non-human things that are fictional entities, like that are doing narration, that's attributing agency. So you can talk about that, like we were saying about AI. Then we can talk about like, how do you have access to fictional worlds? Epistemic access is like access to like the world of mind versus body. It's like, how do you jump worlds? Well, how do you jump this dual world? Then you need like something like a pineal gland, or you talk about like imagination, but no one knows how that works anyway. So it's like you have to create worlds out of something, your imagination. You have a world creation device in your brain. Okay, but like, and as Viper says, well, we hallucinate all the worlds. Fine, but that just reduces the problem to all of rationality. If all of rationality is a human hallucination, fine, but then how do we explain all of rationality? So we had some good discussion here, I felt, on some various topics, but this is why maybe not the most like what people think of as like super important philosophy, but that's what makes like some of this philosophy very interesting and very good. So I mean, again, this might not be your cup of tea, might not be in your area, but it's fine. It was seems like it was well done. I tripped over the words. I didn't love the writing, but that's not a big deal. Scriptotherapy. We had some big freaking words here. Narratological, like why? I mean, this is my complaint because I have to read it. But that's about it. Okay, so that's it for Dees now.